New series of videos of homemade diesel fuel. I'm going to explain some of the first things you want to look into. Videos are going to get kind of long and monotonous, but if you stay tuned, you'll understand all of it. The first things you want to figure out is what can you run the homemade diesel fuel in. So most furnaces, like I would say 2005 and older, they are mostly low pressure fuel systems. They tend to like a 40% gasoline to 60% motor oil mix. Diesel engines like this and trucks that have direct injection pumps will run on this homemade diesel fuel. So you can usually tell because they are kind of like a rotary injection pump. Basically, the dead giveaway is these high pressure fuel lines coming out of the injection pump to the injectors. A lot of questions everyone asks me, will this homemade diesel fuel work in a newer diesel? No, it won't, because the newer diesel engines have too many electronics and sensors. So usually after 2005 they started adding the EGR valve, which will usually clog up with carbon, and then you have the O2 sensor in the exhaust that will usually get coated with carbon so they don't read properly. And also you have the DEF filters, like the DEF system, and all that honeycomb stuff in the exhaust will clog up with carbon as well. See, this homemade diesel fuel, why it's black is because of carbon in it. Now, the whole filtration and settling process gets most of the carbon out of the oil, but it does not get all of it out. So, all this is about to get most of the carbon out so you can still run it in a motor, basically. Like IDI system, they're like the 7.3 liter IDI, those will run on homemade diesel fuel as well. They all require different mixtures. Why they use different mixtures is just because of the different types of fuel systems and common rails and injection pumps and injectors and fuel lines and electric fuel pumps and everything. Like my old dozer here is gravity feed from the fuel tank under the seat down through the fuel filters into the injection pump. So I cannot run this very thick. So these machines tend to like a 30% gasoline to 70% motor oil. I try to mix the fuel as thick as I can because the more oil I can use, the cheaper it gets, because the motor oil I get for free. So that's why the mixtures are different. If you did one standard mix, it would be a 40% gas to 60% oil. That's almost the same exact viscosity as diesel fuel, and that's what we're trying to match or replicate. Stinky Pete here has a better electric pump, and this tends to run on a 90% motor oil and 10% gasoline for my summer mix. For the winter mixes, I usually just add 5 to 10% gasoline to the mix. That way, when it gets like below zero, like 10 below or 15 below, the oil gets a little bit thicker when it gets that cold. So just adding a little bit more gasoline in the mix, boom, you're done. No fuel additives needed, no gelling issues or anything. So Stinky Pete normally runs on a 20% gasoline to 80% motor oil during the winter, like it is right now. My machines will tend to run on a 35 to 40% gasoline to oil mix during the winter like this. If you're in the Arctic, I would probably mix a 50% gasoline to 50% motor oil up in those -40 and -50 below temperatures. But the best part is that this stuff will not gel up. It will tend to stay nice and thin through all those cold temperatures and not have to worry about it. I'll get into more details of the mixtures and viscosities and stuff later on, but I just wanted you to mainly identify what can you run it in. Second thing you need to worry about is not just what to run it in, is trying to secure your liquids on where to go get this kind of stuff. You can go to any local garage, mom and pop show, and junkyards. You can use any kind of oil for this process. So like power steering fluid, brake fluid, gear oil, hydraulic oil, Vaseline, grease, gear oil, hydraulic oil, vegetable oil, animal fat, anything like that. Anything that's an oil-based liquid. If you have a way to turn stuff solid into liquids, you can, like a gasifier, like a still, like when they distill alcohol. So you can even make diesel fuel out of plastics and car tires if you wanted to. But you go to your junkyards and you get totes, and you can go and get them filled and stuff like that. You have a machine with forks, it will help a lot. Getting any kind of oil-based liquids that is thick and thin so you can mix them together to get the right viscosity. So You can get something thick like gear oil and thin it out with something thinner like paint thinner. Go to a body shop, see if you can get some used paint thinner. Transmission shops. Transmission fluid you can almost run straight. It's usually thin enough. Stale gasoline or even fresh gasoline from the pumps. You can use nail polish remover, varnish, anything like that to thin it out. I have to get my shed all cleaned up. I haven't organized it in a while, but basically this is my whole mixing process in my little shed. You really just need 4 or 5 totes, and I can usually make about 250 gallons per week. You want to try to have a machine with forks or a pallet jack so you can move totes around. It's a lot easier. Otherwise, you would have to like put an empty tote where you want it, pump it into that empty tote, and then pump it back out, and basically transferring fuels from tote to tote. And that's what I used to do when I started the whole process. But once I got my machine and a pallet jack from the junkyards and stuff like that, it made it a lot easier. So you could take a shed like this or a garage, or you could take a sea container and set this all up in a sea container or an old tractor trailer. You cut the axles off, put it down on the ground, and you can set up this whole process to do it. My primary oil pump. This kind of pump, it's hard to explain, but there's a little gear in here, and then there's a ring gear in here to pump the fluid in. It's the same thing in most modern oil pumps and engines, or like transmission pumps. These are made to pump straight motor oil or gear oil. That pump is the most important pump you'll need for this whole process. I know that pump is like $600 or $700, but I've had that same pump for years. The pump you need is just a little tiny oil pump. This has like one of those little oscillating little pistons inside, and this will pump straight motor oil, and it pumps it nice and slow. I usually put it like on 6 volts, even though it's a 12-volt pump. I'll explain later why you want to pump that nice and slow. I'll get to that later. And then pretty much the last pump you would need if you want to transfer just the fuel or pre-mixed fuels or gasoline around, like a regular pump like this, and just have some of these extra pickup hoses and screens. I used one of them on my big pump right there with about a 20-foot hose. The thing you have to worry about before you start doing any homemade diesel fuel, after you figure out what machines or furnaces will run on it, and also after figuring out where to get your oil and gasoline and stuff, is you gotta look up your local laws and regulations. So in the state of Pennsylvania, I explained in previous videos that it's legal, but just barely. On their DOT website, there's a list of what's called alternative fuels. Vegetable oil is on that list. So technically, to run vegetable oil here in Pennsylvania or anywhere in the United States for their federal DOT book, you need to have a permit and registration. And you have to pay your road taxes on it. So for homemade diesel fuel, there's kind of a loophole that the law does not specifically state you cannot run motor oil in your vehicle. Your motor needs oil to run, either as a lubricant or as fuel. So it's basically it's like a 2-stroke engine, like a road legal dirt bike or jet skis or snowmobiles or anything like that. When I talk to attorneys and judges, I'm technically running mixed gasoline. So that's the loophole. The only laws I can find out is you cannot sell it without proper permits and certifications. There's one. The second thing is you cannot use in a commercial vehicle. The law states a commercial vehicle can only run on on-road diesel fuel. So technically under that clause, you cannot run any alternative fuels except ultra-low highway diesel fuel and stuff like that. So do not use this fuel in a commercial vehicle. But for off-road use, like excavators and machines, completely legal. Those are off-road use. So anything like that is no big deal. Also, on the stale gasoline I get from junkyards, the road taxes are already paid for on this gasoline. Your sales tax is paid for, and your road taxes are paid for. Motor oil, your sales taxes are already paid for. You're just reusing the other stuff that people paid for and don't want anymore. So this is legal in most states, but you have to look up your laws. The other laws you might run into is emissions. So, like, this would be illegal in California and New York City because of their emissions and crap. So you gotta check into your laws, make sure everything is legal before doing anything like that. The other thing is your laws for township. There's laws for how much combustible liquids you can have on your property and stuff. So in my county, if I remember correctly, was 1,000 gallons of fuel. So there's nothing saying motor oil. So just mainly I have to worry about how much gasoline I have and how much pre-mixed gasoline and oil I have. But as long as I stay under that 1,000 gallons, I'm good to go. All these laws I have looked into myself. I've looked into all the different online websites and stuff, looking up all local laws. I had friends of mine that are attorneys looked into it. I called a couple of friends of mine that are police officers, and I even talked to a judge about this before making videos on it and sharing this knowledge with you. And so it was a big pain in the butt. I think I spent about 3 to 4 weeks doing research to make sure this was all legal. Because I started doing this a long time ago when I desperately needed fuel and I cannot afford to buy fuel. I'm like, why can I not keep doing this? So I checked to make sure it's legal. And when I found the little loopholes and stuff, I'm like, I'm going to keep doing this. Why keep spending $5-6 a gallon for diesel fuel when I can make my own for usually around 10 to 40 cents per gallon? Another law there is you can only have so many combustible liquids inside your house, which is a living residence. I do this all in my shed out in the middle of the field, and there's no houses within about 150 yards. So these are all storage buildings. So all this is done nice and safe, and I will explain later when you're transferring the gasoline to be careful of the fumes and everything like that. Another thing you want to keep in mind, I haven't done it yet, but what I plan on doing in my shed, putting the rubber mats or tarps in here to contain any oil spills. I'm going to get ready to pull everything out of here and get that done. I have never had time to do it yet. I'm hoping to get it done before I start my new job. But I have a whole pallet of rubber, which was used for like rubber roofings and like the liners for ponds and stuff like that. Basically, it's in case of a busted tank or valve or something like that, it has a way to contain all the fluids. So usually you don't have to worry about too much because of residential, but if you're doing this commercially, this is a huge deal. But for personal use, it's really not that big a deal. I have in my shed, the whole floor is tapered to a drain in the corner there, and also that goes down into a grease trap and everything. But I have the drain sealed off right now, so I accidentally spilled, I think the one day when that barrel overfilled, about 20 gallons, and it all stayed in my shed, and I just cleaned it up with some kitty litter and the wet dry vac of the squeegee and stuff. But always keep that kind of stuff on hand and keep an eye for it. You do not want to have any major spills. That's a big deal. To try to keep up with your local, DEP or EPA or whatever. I can't think of all of it. I'm not up to date on all these technical terms, but you want to try to keep this as clean and safe as possible. To be honest, I really need a drip pan for my machines. Both of my machines are antiques. They're both 67, and every time I park them, you can see how they leak underneath. So my machines, I really need to get them like drip pans under it and stuff like that. But these are all issues you want to keep up with. So if there's any issues, everything is done and kept up with. Still working on my shed and my property to get all this stuff set up better and to be safer. It's just been really hard to get time away from work and everything. But like I said, I have a whole pallet of all this rubber matting stuff. So I'm going to do all my storage totes in the back of the shed. I'm going to lay that rubber down and have the edges up and everything. Containments, I forget what they're called, but I'm getting ready to do all that for my storage totes in the back in my shed, so everything is nice and clean. And I try to stay under that 1,000 gallon limit. And if you go a little bit over, they're not going to kill you over it. Like I said before, this is all residential stuff, so you have a little bit more leeway with this. Same thing with like on-road use. If personal use, you can do a lot more things than commercial use. So, but any totes you have, you gotta make sure you check them every week. Make sure none of them are leaking, none of them are damaged. Also, make sure the valves have the caps on them, so in case the valves start leaking, no issues. So far, the only spill I've ever had was in my shed when that barrel overflowed, and it was about 20 gallons or so. But like I said, it was all contained in my shed. I cleaned it all up, and those are things you just want to keep an eye on. Well, I got my machine started, letting it warm up. What I'm getting ready to do is take some of these empty totes I have behind my shed back to the junkyard, because these totes are not even mine. I just basically pick up the totes of motor oil and gasoline. I use what I can out of them, and I take them right back. So like I said before, you don't need this many totes. I'm going to do what, I think 3 or 4 trips to the junkyard today. Take what, I think it was I think about 10 of these totes I'm taking back to the junkyard. I can either put them all on my trailer, but I don't want to take the time to ratchet strap them down. I'm not that far, it's only like 5 miles down the road. So I'm just going to put 2 on the back of Stinky Pete, take him back to the junkyard, and he's going to fill them basically back up of either motor oil or gasoline. These 2 totes of gasoline are going back to the junkyard today, and almost all of these motor oil totes are going back. And once I set the 1 tote on, I'll go ahead, grab the top tote, and basically since I can't reach all the way to the back of the truck, I'll just get lined up here and push it in. Push totes in, you got to make sure you don't poke into the bottom of the front one. And if your forks stick out through the bottom of the tote, you want to make sure the fork is going into the, like, underneath this tote. If you have it too high, you don't want to poke a hole into the bottom of these totes with your forks. If I wanted to, with empty totes, I can have 2 high and still be under my 13-foot tall, height. So I can put another 2 empty totes on this and strap them down and take them in 4 at a time. Normally when I pick up gasoline or oil from anywhere, I normally only do just 1 tote. To one, stay under that weight limit of the truck, because this is only a 1/2 ton, and I try to stay under so many gallons and stuff like that. Even though I do have my hazmat and tanker endorsements, but I try to stay under those limits. Technically, you're not supposed to have more than 100 gallons of oil or fuel in your truck, but like I said before, with residential use, you have a little bit more leeway. So I'm only getting like gasoline and oil from a local shop and bringing it straight home. I'm not doing like all over the place and stuff like that. Okay, normally when I pick up gasoline from the junkyard as well, is I usually have just the 1, and I usually have 1 or 2 straps on these, usually 3 of them. You want to have usually 1 in front, which is usually this rear one is the one that'll usually have gasoline in it. So I usually put 1 from the side rail to the other side along the front of this tote in case I have to do an emergency stop. I do usually 2 over the top of it, and I usually have 1 in the back too in case I have to like really accelerate hard, but it's up against the tailgate as well. Or you can put it towards the front of the truck like this. That way you're up against the header board, and then you can still have like 1 strap along the back and 1 or 2 over top. In case you have to do an emergency brake situation, you have no issues. During the summer, I usually have my air conditioner in the back window, so I usually keep it towards the middle or back of the truck. Right now, I could usually keep a full one towards the front right now without the air conditioner. Another stuff I like to do is put like a tire right here beside of them so they can't twist. You know, they stay good up against the wheel well or the header board or tailgate, but like a rim tire here and rim tire there, or just an empty bad tire to help keep these from shifting will help too. Dropping off these 2 empty totes and put them over here in the pile of other empty totes so they can fill them up with oil or gasoline from all the junk vehicles. All vehicles stacked up ready to get processed. So like they drain all the fluids out, they take your rims and tires off. They have a rim crusher to get the tires off the rims. Basically your normal junkyard stuff, you know. This is what they do every day. Now what they usually do with the motor oil, most of that motor oil they burn for heat, to heat their shops. So I tend to get motor oil which they don't need, like the extra oil, or from local shops. I still go pick it up because I don't get a lot of oil from the junkyard because he burns so much of it, but he doesn't use any of the gasoline. So I usually buy what I need. Whatever I don't need, he'll have a company come up and pump out his tanks and totes that goes to like recycler and stuff like that. So I usually just buy what I need in stale gasoline. I only need usually about 1 tote a year of gasoline, because I'm not mixing that much fuel. My personal use, I only use maybe about 500 gallons a year between my truck here, my machines and heat and all that, so I really don't need that much gasoline. Other things I like about junkyards is not just getting liquids or fuels, basically unwanted stuff that I can use and recycle basically. These tires and plastics, with a gas fire you can heat up and recondense into diesel fuel or gasoline, or you could just take that vapor, run it right into your furnace and burn it, or you can run it into like a generator, like the air intake of a generator, and just feed it right in and run off the flammable gases from these tires. You have energy right here that nobody wants. You can reuse. Like I said before, use motor oil and gasoline when it's mixed. Motor oil has more energy than diesel fuel. So I tend to see about a 30% increase on horsepower, torque, and fuel mileage. So usually I was getting about 18 miles per gallon on diesel fuel with Stinky Pete. Now I get over 27. So there are benefits, and there's only there's a lot of benefits, but there's only a couple downsides of running motor oil. One of the downsides is it runs a lot hotter than regular diesel fuel. If you can adjust your air fuel mixture, you just cut it back. If you can adjust your timing, advance it a couple degrees, because it takes a little bit longer to ignite because it has a higher flash point. So advance that a little bit. The downside of it as well is the extra carbon buildup in the exhaust system, but it's nothing that the motor can't handle, either in the cylinders or the exhaust itself. Now, running it in a furnace, because it burns hotter and then you have that carbon buildup, you have to make sure it's a good furnace. Usually I run this in a boiler type system furnace, and so with the boiler it can handle the higher heat better, and you got to make sure it has good fireproofing on the inside, that like asbestos or firebox type stuff, so the flame is not in direct contact to the sides of the furnace, because when you're burning motor oil, it's a little bit corrosive. So if the flames are direct contact of the metal itself, will tend to corrode it away. So on like forced hot air furnaces, if that asbestos flame catch goes bad and that flame comes in direct contact with the heat tubes, it will either get too hot to either potentially melt them, lose their temper, or corrode them. So that's something to keep in mind as well when you're running in a furnace. Also, you'll have extra carbon buildup in the firebox itself and also the chimney. Not a whole ton. Worst case scenario, after about 5 to 8 years, you'll have to take the burner out, go in there like a wet dry vac and suck up some of the carbon buildup sitting on the bottom. Every once in a while, you might get a carbon buildup building on the nozzle on the furnace. You might have to clean off. And if the nozzle clogged up because of maybe some dirty fuel that got past your fuel filter, you could just take the nozzle out, take it apart, clean it, put it back in. And also, to adjust the furnace to run on motor oil, because there's more energy in it, you usually have to either add a little bit more air or take away. You just make an adjustment, look outside your chimney, see if there's any smoke coming out. I believe white smoke is too much air, black smoke is too little air. So just little adjustments like that. Your furnace will tend to kick on for a smaller period of time running on motor oil, and tend to stay off longer periods of time because it gets so hot so fast. So I was planning on doing an outdoor wood burner that has the diesel burner on it. Take the diesel burner out and get an actual waste oil burner from these furnaces that are made to run motor oil. I'd put that in, and then I can run straight motor oil, and it's pretty much free to heat the house during the winter. Right now, I'm just running on that 40% gas and 60% motor oil mix. That's it. So I'll try to keep updated on all these different things and all this information, but on to the next thing. One question is, for commercial use that's for offer, like bulldozers, something like machines with like a C15 engines and stuff like that, really big engines, like big D5 or D6s and stuff like that. The old ones can run on this homemade diesel fuel, like old loaders and bobcats and skid steers, but like I said before, it runs hot. So if you're running a bulldozer and running it like full throttle and pushing big amounts of dirt, you might have issues with the exhaust temperature or the engine temperature, especially on big industrial engines like that. So something to keep in mind. It will work, but you got to keep an eye on those temperatures, like I said before. Most engines and machines, like my machines, I'm not running them heavy duty, and they have big enough radiators they can stay cool no problem. But those machines should stay cool. Just keep an eye on it. You really want to make sure the exhaust temperature doesn't get too hot. I got my shed cleaned out now. I did forget to tell you, you do need a wet dry vac for the whole process. But as you can see, this is the whole mixing process pretty much right here. This is the only stuff you really need. The rest of it you don't have to have. But I'll show you once I get this all set up to run more batches. I used to have that pump mounted up on the wall, and what I did was I had a tote here, like these 3 totes with mixed fuel. I used to have it hooked up where I could just at any time flip valves and pump out whatever batch I want and fill up the truck. I used to have the metal pickup hose right here that threaded into the lid of these totes right here. And I had it so it stayed about 3 inches off the bottom, but once that pump went bad, I didn't replace it or anything like that. So I just kind of left it up there. I never even took it down off the wall yet. But that's something I know you'll see. I tried that in the past, but I don't need it anymore. Just like these centrifuges. But as you can see, an old wet dry vac. I showed you before, the big pump, the little pump. You'll need like a funnel. Like a drill with a mixer that I made that'll fit down into the totes to mix it. This big funnel, which this mega funnel, I'll explain later why it's nice to have that. An old like 25-gallon drum and a bed sheet. The thread count, I don't know what that is. It's a very coarse thread count on it. You can use a t-shirt if you want, but I've been using the same bed sheet for 6 years. You'll see later in the videos, you do not have to replace the bed sheet. You use the wet dry vac and you can clean it out every 1,000 gallons of motor oil or whatnot. So I'll show you later in the videos. Still do not organize my workbench, but I'm going to move this vacuum over, but I got my machine with another tote of oil. I'm going to bring it in. Now all the totes are in place. That's the stale gasoline. These are my 2 mixing totes, my first stage motor oil, my raw motor oil. Now this motor oil was already sitting outside for 4 weeks, so I brought it in here. Yeah, I did disturb it a little bit, but it's going to sit in here for a couple days and let it settle back down, make sure everything is settled to the bottom. That's very important for this whole process, is letting things settle. That's the best way and the fastest way to get this filtered nice and clean. Water is more dense than motor oil, so it's going to settle to the bottom of this tote. Antifreeze, metal, dirt, anything like that is going to settle to the bottom of this tote. Now, anything that's the same density as motor oil, like hair, dust, and pine needles and leaves, will be floating around inside the oil. Anything less dense than the oil will float on the top. But that's what the bed sheet is for. The bed sheet is to catch all that crap that's the same density or less dense. It's the same thing with this stale gasoline. You can use fresh gasoline if you want to. If you can get stale gasoline from junkyards, then go ahead and do that. I buy this for $1 a gallon. Gasoline I get from junkyards is usually very clear, so you can see right through the bottom. You'll see all the mud and dirt and crap at the bottom of these. If you want, you could take a little sample of some gasoline, mix it with some dirt, shake it up and set it on the shelf, and you'll see how it will settle out. No problem. Another important thing, when you're using the gasoline, always make sure that the lids are tight. And also make sure the lids are airtight, because this gasoline, you don't want it to evaporate and get either more stale or lose any gasoline just from evaporation. Now, most of these lids on these totes will have either a little vent on them. Like inside that center cap, there's a spring-loaded valve. So when you drain these totes from the bottom valves, it lets air in. But what's bad is it lets air out as well. So you want to try to make sure the lids are completely airtight. Now, motor oil does not matter. The straight motor oil, it can be vented. You don't have to worry about it. It's only the gasoline and your mixed fuel you do not want to have exposed to the air. So after you mix the gasoline oil, try to make sure it's in fully airtight totes. If it stays airtight, like this tote that's mixed fuel, it will last for like 5-6+ years. It doesn't go bad long as it's not exposed to the air. So like for the furnace to heat the house, whatever fuel I don't use during the winter, I have to in the fall add more gasoline to the mix to get it right to the proper viscosity. That's something you have to keep an eye out. So like my machines and like my truck and stuff, if my machines were going to sit for like, let's just say several days in a row, then you have to make sure you have extra gasoline in the mix so you can kind of factor in that evaporation of the fuel and stuff sitting for long periods of time. But if it's in airtight containers, you don't have to worry about it. If it's straight motor oil, you don't have to worry about it.